Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and good morning, depending on where you are. Thank you for taking the time today to join us, our first webinar of 2026. I am Tina Barr, the Director of Training and Education for the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, which we refer to as NACOL. NACOL is an organization that works to create a community of support for independent civilian oversight entities seeking to make their local law enforcement agencies, jails, and prisons more transparent, accountable, and responsive to the communities they serve. One part of that effort is our webinar series. Since 2015, NACOL has worked to bring you information via our webinars on effective practices in civilian oversight, innovations in the field, and efforts to reform the criminal legal system. Before we get started today, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping things. First, you do have the ability to turn on your captions if you would like to do so by clicking the captions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Also, please note that the chat feature is disabled. However, the Q&A feature is on. And so you can type your questions in the Q&A box at any time. However, to ensure that our speaker today has the time to get through their prepared remarks, we will address the questions at the end of the prepared presentation. Everyone does have the ability to upvote a question. And so you do that by clicking the thumbs up icon beside a particular question. And by doing that, the particular question moves up the queue, which will help us to address some of the most pressing questions after the presentation. Oftentimes, we don't get to all of the questions that are posed during the webinar 1 hour time period. So to account for that, or to allow more time for questions and actual direct engagement between the audience and our speaker for today, we will have immediately after the webinar a 30-minute post-webinar discussion. To take part in that discussion, I will provide you with a Zoom link to a Zoom meeting room at the end of the webinar, which you will have to click so that we can enter the meeting room and get out of this webinar. I will post that in the Q&A and also in the chat that goes directly out to audience members, maybe 10 minutes or so before the end of the webinar. And finally, today's webinar is being recorded and will be available to registrants only for 3 months. You will receive an email within 5 business days of today with information on how to access the recording, as well as that will include a PDF version of the slides that you'll see today. All right. So our webinar for today is Immigration Detention, Oversight's Forgotten Space. For the sake of time, I'm going to give an abbreviated description of the webinar and also of the speaker's bio. You can see the full description and the full speaker bio on the webinar page of the NACOL website. Our speaker today, Kate Eves, will explore what we might learn from immigration detention in efforts to be more transparent, effective, and impactful in the world of oversight. She will examine questions such as, what are the barriers to identifying mistreatment amongst vulnerable populations? And what is the right relationship between independent oversight and internal checks and balances? Kate will also explore how UK statutory inquiries function as a form of oversight in spaces where people are detained or incarcerated, and what contribution they can make to oversight methodology more generally. So today our speaker is Kate Eves. Kate has over 20 years of experience conducting research, inspections, and investigations within custodial environments in the UK and the US. She's a member of the Independent Advisory Panel on Deaths in Custody, which is a group of experts who advise UK government on the prevention of deaths in all forms of state custody. Kate was awarded the Order of the British Empire in 2024 in recognition of her public service in this field. So without further ado, I am going to turn things over to Kate, and I will go off camera for now.
Thank you, Tina. So good evening from me. I'm joining you from London, but good morning, good afternoon to everybody else, wherever you are in the US. So I'm Kate Eves. Thank you again, Tina, for the introduction. I'm hoping that I will see some familiar faces when we have the discussion session after this webinar. I've been involved with NACOL for around about 10 years now. And as you can tell by my accent, I'm British, but I lived and worked in the US for a number of years. And while I was there, worked with and still continue now to work with a number of US jurisdictions. as well as doing oversight work here in the UK. So I'm going to give you a slightly different kind of perspective on oversight today. And I'm going to, before I sort of dive into what I found in the inquiry that I chaired into abuse in an immigration setting, I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of context about what immigration detention looks like in the UK. So this is obviously, it's a very timely discussion, it feels, to be having a conversation about the subject of immigration and the questions around robust oversight of how the powers related to immigration are exercised. I know that it is an extremely difficult time at the moment. So to give you some context of how the picture looks here in the UK, at the time that I issued my report, which was in 2023, around about 20,000 people were detained annually for immigration reasons in the UK. It's very much an evolving picture. Our own kind of approach to how and why we detain people for immigration purposes is something that is changing rapidly at the moment here. So I'm giving you data that it was kind of true at the time of my reporting to give you that context. Also, at the time of the report, Brook House Immigration Removal Centre was one of 7 immigration removal centres. I might slip into calling it an IRC, which is our acronym that we tend to use in the UK. All of those immigration removal centres, although they are the responsibility of the Home Office, which is our version of the Department of Homeland Security, they were all contracted out to private providers. So Brook House itself is on the outskirts of London. If anybody has flown into a London airport, it's very near to Gatwick Airport. In fact, you can see it from the runway. It's built to the specification of a Category B prison. There are 4 categories of prison in the UK, from A to D, A being the most secure and restrictive, and Category D often referred to as an open prison. So a Category B is kind of the equivalent of what most medium secure facilities look like in the US. Brook House is designed to house around about 500 adult men. Okay, so a little bit of context, and any of you that have heard me at an ACOL conference before or event before talking about what oversight looks like for corrections and detained settings in the UK will have heard me talk about these 3 prongs of oversight. So generally, I will have been talking about how that works in a prison or correctional setting, but actually these same organisations also have responsibility for immigration detention oversight. Now, you'll notice that the name, there's kind of a clue in the name for 2 of the organisations, and it's obvious what the foundations of those organisations are, what they were designed to oversee. And therein lies some of the issues that we're kind of going to end up discussing throughout the webinar. So His Majesty Chief Inspector of Prisons, which is probably the one that's the most well known, they conduct what they call a healthy prison inspection. So they're looking at elements that they can measure against other similar prisons. They go into every facility throughout the UK. They have full golden key, it's often called access, so unfettered access. They turn up unannounced. They're at a facility for 2 weeks en masse, so a large team of inspectors and then also specialist researchers who accompany them to do the quantitative and qualitative analysis of what's actually going on in that prison or facility, immigration centre in this context. They are professional, full-time, paid inspectors. So that's kind of how they sit in that picture. The second prong is independent monitoring boards. So these are volunteer members. They generally have a presence. So there'll be a team of monitors who have a rota. They will generally have a presence in the prison pretty much every day, but they're not there at night, and they're not always there at weekends. It's their role essentially to act as monitors. So they're drawn from the community around the facility, and they supposed to act as the principle behind it is they act as the community eyes and ears of what's going on behind bars. So they do have access to a lot of information. They don't have unfettered access necessarily, but they are in and around the prison and or facility and are able to speak to people every day. They can also deal with complaints that sometimes those who are being detained raise with them. There's then also a Prisons and Probation Ombudsman's Office, and this has a responsibility in relation to also to immigration detention, as I say, and they deal with complaints investigation. They act as the kind of independent arbitrator once the complaints have gone through the internal complaint system for the jurisdiction, and they also carry out investigations into deaths. Okay, so less well known is what I'm going to talk a little bit more about is what the Brooke House inquiry was. So there are inquiries which are frequently called statutory inquiries, and that's because they were established under this legislation called the Inquiries Act of 2005. They often are called for. They can be established in relation to any kind of issue. So it's generally an issue that is of serious public concern and where the other forms of investigation or oversight or scrutiny have failed to provide adequate answers to what happened. So, for example, there was a long-running inquiry into childhood sexual abuse, which reported around about the same time as the Brooke House inquiry, actually. And we also have had a long-running inquiry into miscarriages of justice of various different causes. There's been statutory inquiries into police shootings. There's also currently one into the COVID inquiry, into the COVID pandemic and the government response to that. So a really broad range of issues. And at any one time, there's somewhere between 15 and 25 statutory inquiries taking place in the UK. So the thing that makes them different to the other forms of oversight is that the chairs of inquiries have quasi-judicial powers. So they're able to compel witnesses, they can hold their hearings in public, and they can also award funding for legal costs to witnesses, to those who've been impacted, to people who need representation to make sure that their perspectives are heard essentially. Inquiry chairs do, probably for obvious reasons, do tend to be judges or retired judges, but they are on occasion subject matter experts. I'm not a judge or a retired judge, and so I was appointed to chair the Brooke House inquiry because I'm a subject matter expert in the issue of safe and decent detention. Okay. So I've run through a little bit of this already. So Brooke House, yes, it's just outside Gatwick Airport, so outskirts of London, holds built to hold around 500 adult men. Brooke House inquiry came about because a young, I think he was 19 at the time, detention officer, so that's the kind of lowest, most junior frontline member of staff, was really concerned by what he was seeing, the treatment he was seeing, the culture that he was observing around him. And he had no faith in the official whistleblowing systems that were actually in place through the private contractor that was running the facility. So he'd recently seen a BBC investigative journalist expose of abuse going on in a different type of setting in actually a children's home, and it occurred to him that actually one way of exposing what was happening was to go to the BBC. And so he did that. He was provided with with recording equipment, and over several months, he covertly recorded what was happening on the housing units, on the wings in healthcare at Brooke House. So the inquiry was established essentially to look at what happened between a 5-month period in 2017. I should say as well, and I will make sure that Tina has all of this, and also my email will be circulated as well. So if you've got any follow-up questions about where you can locate some of this, then I'm very happy to provide that. But it is still possible to watch the Panorama documentary that resulted from this expose by the undercover detention officer. So if you're interested in kind of seeing the type of footage that he captured, then I'm very happy to point you in the direction of where to find that. So essentially the inquiry took 4 years. We received over 100,000 pages of evidence, many hundreds of hours of CCTV footage, body-worn camera footage, and also that covert footage as well. Heard from over 100 witnesses, commissioned experts into the areas of use of force, clinical care, and the specifics of kind of cultural environment issues in a detained immigration setting as well. We had 6 weeks of public hearings, and those are genuinely public hearings. So they're held in a building in central London. There's a public gallery, but they're also live streamed on YouTube. And so people could watch people giving their evidence. They could look at the all of the evidence that had been provided to give context to what that witness was telling the inquiry. So it's very kind of open and transparent process, deliberately so. Following the publication of the report, so it resulted in a 700-page report, and we had a really good level of interest, public interest. So the report was covered by all the major news outlets, over 100 media articles on the day of the publication. I also was called to give evidence to 2 parliamentary committees, which is kind of the equivalent of Congress in the US. So there was a real additional elements of scrutiny that kind of flowed from the fact that we published that information and what we were able to kind of reveal about what had been happening. Okay, so let's move on to what I actually found. So I'm going to talk about, not going to talk about it in extensive detail, but the one of the kind of key measures that I needed to be mindful of was whether the kind of mistreatment that was seen on the footage and that we were able to kind of interrogate and expose through the process of the inquiry, were they so serious as to amount to what would be a contravention of the European Convention on Human Rights. So particularly this article around not being subjected to torture or inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. I found 19 incidents that were credible of amounting to that. And the reason for the slightly garbled language, having to say credible evidence, is that statutory inquiries are specifically not allowed to find criminal or civil liability. So the findings are findings of fact, and they are evidence, but any litigation or prosecution that follows is a separate process. So it's just really important that, I'm not saying that there was a breach of human rights. I'm saying that there's evidence to support the fact that that may be the case if there were to be litigation or prosecution afterwards. I'm sure the lawyers amongst you will appreciate the technicalities of that. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what those incidents look like. So one of the most serious was the application of pressure to a detainee's neck when he was lying on the ground, having just attempted to take his own life following a series of serious self-harm incidents, and he was in severe distress. And a detention officer put his hand around the detained person's throat, whispered into his ear that he was going to put him to sleep, and used a number of profanities. And the undercover officer essentially said to him, ease off, ease off, ease off. And so his hands were around his neck for around about 10 seconds. There was also repeated use of dangerous restraint techniques, which have been associated with deaths as a result of positional asphyxia. So primarily the handcuffing of people behind their back and then being pushed forward, so compressing their chest. There were several instances of use of force being used on detainees when they were naked or near naked, which I found to be inhumane, and inappropriate and humiliating comments when detainees were in severe distress, including during or immediately after serious self-harm or suicide attempts. There were also instances of failing to assist in the aftermath of a suicide attempt. So somebody having fallen from having ligatured on an item in their cell, but the officer who responded then failed to take the ligature from around their neck. So as well as the individual incidents themselves, I made findings around the fact that there was an environment that made it all the more likely that these kinds of abuses were likely to happen. And so there are a number of more thematic findings around what was happening in the facility at the time, and those related to, firstly, that the environment itself was completely unsuitable for long-term detention. So although it's designed to the specification of a category B prison, which obviously is sometimes used for longer term detention, all of the things that mitigate against small cells, cramped cells, all of those things, such as adequate space for associating on the wings, adequate exercise yard, adequate education space. None of those things were built into the specification because the intention was always going to be that it was for very short-term periods to hold people just before they were going to be removed from the country. There were also really significant failures in safeguards for vulnerable detainees. And I'm thinking specifically around those people who either had a history of torture, so arrived in immigration detention, either having been tortured en route to arriving or as part of their background and history prior to being detained. Also for people whose mental and physical health was being really injuriously affected by the process of detention, including very serious self-harm and suicide attempts. So there are safeguards in place to identify those people, but they weren't working, they were failing. There was also inappropriate and excessive use of force. So force was far too often a measure of first resort rather than a measure of last resort. And there was a real failure to do any kind of risk assessment to work out the right way to use force in certain circumstances. So one example that springs to mind is a frail older man who had been on hunger strike, and the method used to escort him from one cell to another cell was 4 officers going into his cell in full riot gear, which included kind of helmets and big gloves and riot shields. So a disproportionality in how force was being used, but also the use of pain compliance techniques, and again, restraining and moving people when they were naked or near naked, which was completely unnecessary a lot of the time. There was also a really serious issue about medical staff not understanding their safeguarding role. So in particular around the use of force. So for example, not highlighting where a dangerous technique was being used. So that was really concerning. Also not ensuring that if they were being called to observe a planned use of force, so if they knew that they were going to be likely to need to use force to remove somebody from the country, not ensuring that that medical member of staff was actually in a position to be able to see the person's airway. So that was specifically relevant in the case that I talked about, where the hands were placed around the detained person's throat, that the nurse that was actually observing what was happening did not put themselves in a position where they could actually see what was happening to the person, so they weren't able to see whether or not they had a clear airway. There was also a really striking tendency to view mental health and distress as a discipline issue, as a disobedience, infraction, as manipulation. And rather than understanding what a pattern of behaviour might be showing, and that might actually be indicating that somebody was in severe distress or actually was in need of mental health intervention. So there was a pattern around effectively punishing people who were in distress and using force and using segregating them rather than addressing what was going on. And very closely connected to that was the inadequate training and support that the staff, who in the main were very inexperienced, not used to working in such a challenging and complicated environment with very many vulnerable men with very complex needs, and an automatic power imbalance between themselves and the people that they were caring for, were looking after. But there was not a sophisticated enough understanding of what that power dynamic looked like and how it could be wielded in a way that was completely inappropriate. So a lot of that seemed to transpire in using in kind of inappropriate language, in swearing, in kind of being very dismissive and derogatory to detained people, and not understanding that, you know, this isn't about having a conversation with somebody who's on an equal footing to you, that you have the power in this relationship and you're using that power inappropriately. But there was just not an adequate understanding of that dynamic at all, which was probably, for any of you on the call who are in the business of oversight for correctional settings, that's probably something that will sound familiar to you. There was also the other thing to say about the staff, of course, is that there just weren't enough of them. So there were people who were working, you know, double and triple shifts, who were not well rested, who were fraught, tired, overworked, themselves not able to deal with the kind of highly pressurized environment of people who, you know, in the main are in high states of distress. That we had the same people being used repeatedly for use of force, planned use of force incidents. So people who would kind of have all of their gear on, would be about to take it off, and then they'd be asked to go to another use of force incident. And so there became this kind of desensitization, and this make it effectively kind of forgetting about the person behind the door that they were going into to move, because it just became kind of a part of a conveyor belt of practice, essentially. There was really poor contract monitoring by the Home Office, so the equivalent of the Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security. And one of the things that's really striking, and thinking about this from the sort of oversight perspective, was that there just seemed to be this misguided belief that because there are structures of oversight, such as His Majesty's Inspector of Prisons and the Independent Monitoring Board, that actually they function as the eyes and ears of what's happening in the facility, and that the people who are responsible for contracting out the service can almost kind of breathe a sigh of relief and allow that to take its course. Of course, actually, the Independent Monitoring Board are the eyes and ears of the community. They don't see the contract, they don't monitor the contract, they don't have access to lots of the information that they would need to. And they're volunteers, they're part-time volunteers. And so it's just a completely inappropriate expectation to be placed on people. And it also means that the level of responsibility for those actually delivering the service, that they don't feel that they themselves need to be kind of on the ground quite so much to understand what the actual reality is, what the dynamic is between staff and detained people, what might be the signs of things not working as they should be. Relatedly, a completely inadequate internal complaints and whistleblowing processes. The investigations just did not have the sufficient robustness. There were not kind of clear outcomes and follow-ups. There was not an adequate assessment of what patterns of complaints might be showing about what was happening in the facility. And the fact that a staff member with concerns didn't trust the whistleblowing process in itself is really damning and really concerning. That said, I did find some weaknesses in the external oversight mechanisms themselves. And I suppose the theme that runs through the most clearly and concerningly, and is something that I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail, is a failure to kind of really recognise what are some of the more insidious signs of mistreatment or abuse. So nobody expects that a member of staff is going to put their hands around the throat of a detained person in front of an inspector. But there are other signs that things are going wrong, and that those things weren't adequately picked up on. And I'm going to return to some of those issues in a bit more detail, and also have several resources that might be useful for people that are interested to know a bit more about that. Okay, so lessons for oversight. Sorry, I've got ahead of myself before I'd actually moved on to the slide. So yeah, an over-reliance on these independent monitors who are not there all the time. They're not there en masse and with access to everything at all times of day and night, and they're volunteers. They do have training and they have a monitoring framework to work to, but there's a limit to what's appropriate to expect from them. And these insidious signs of abuse, as I mentioned, that's really concerning. The the other issue I thought was really interesting about oversight was just, there was just they were insufficiently challenging of both the private contractor and the Home Office. So they were too willing to accept the explanations and the perspective of senior management, both within the Home Office and within the private contractor, without kind of pushing back and being really robust to identify what really was happening. So there just wasn't enough of a kind of professional skepticism, I guess, about what they were being told by management. Really crucially, and I think this gets to the core of what a lot of the challenges are when we're talking about people who are vulnerable for these particular reasons. So in an immigration detention environment, is that the detained people just didn't understand what the IMB were there for. So they didn't understand that they could confidentially complain to them, talk to them, tell them what the issues were. And partly we understood through kind of understanding the backgrounds of the people who've been detained and through the evidence that was given to us that they have plenty of reasons to be very fearful of the formal processes of the state. And that's because a lot of the time the backgrounds that they come from and the situations that they come from mean that they have good reason to fear what those in power may do. And so there is an automatic fear of speaking up and advocating for themselves if something has happened, if they've been mistreated or they've witnessed something, mistreatment of somebody else. And so the concept of what independent and confidential oversight looks like is just something which was completely unfamiliar, and there was not enough time and consideration given to how to build confidence in people about what could be achieved by speaking to independent monitorers. Partly the other challenge related to that is that it's a very transient population, and so the challenge in building up the relationship with people is so much more acute than it would be in a correctional setting where generally, other than for very high turnover jails in our system, you would have the ability to kind of build up some trust and rapport with people over a period of days, weeks, months, whereas that might not be the case for people in immigration detention. There's then also the obvious challenge of around communication and language, and also the challenge around fear of repercussions for someone's immigration status. So those things combined are really powerful disincentives to actually engage with external oversight. We also made some findings about the fact that the legislation underpinning what the role of independent monitoring boards was outdated in terms of what they were actually performing. And that was just unhelpful, that they needed kind of legislation that reflected their actual role. But they were ill-equipped because a lot of the time they didn't have access to the information that they needed to be able to kind of push back on what they were seeing themselves when compared to the data that might be being presented by senior management. So the other element that was of concern with regard to external and independent oversight was that both the independent monitoring board they were consistently there throughout this 5-month period when the abuse was happening. The inspectorate had actually been at the facility around the same time as well and hadn't identified any of these issues. They had, however, been given some evidence around people saying that they didn't feel safe. What the report that actually resulted from the inspection, I found, was too positive in its overall tone, given some of the really concerning evidence that perhaps, although did not come from a large number of individuals, the nature of what people were disclosing about what was happening and what they were concerned about and their feelings around safety and decency and security should have been better reflected in the overall tone and findings of the inspection report. And again, relatedly, as I talked about with the independent monitoring board, that the methodology that was developed for how places of detention are inspected, they're drawn from prison environments. So they're developed from a prisons inspectorate that then was given responsibility to also inspect immigration detention. So actually having a form of inspection which is properly tailored and adapted to reflect the fact of all of those disincentives that I've talked about around issues with communication, issues with trust, issues with the transient population, issues with fear of those in power, those in authority, need to be thought about in more depth and better reflected to make sure that they're completely appropriate for the setting that they're applying to. So I'm going to talk a little bit more. Sorry, I'm going to go back a slide so that I don't distract people by having that one up. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this insidious signs of abuse, because it's something that kind of comes up time and time again, and often I've been asked to talk to different organisations who engage in oversight about what do I mean by that, and what could have been identified in a more robust way to inform a better, more reflective inspection report, for example, or for independent monitoring board members to identify from some of the things that they might be witnessing, to put together those pieces to kind of establish what that actually might mean about the culture and treatment and conditions in the facility. So I kind of tend to group these into a couple of different areas, and there are some really helpful resources. One of which is I have a reference for, and I'm also very happy to provide people with a link. So there was some guidance that was actually developed partly following the findings of the Brooke House inquiry. So it reflects quite a lot of what I talk about in my gigantic 3-volume, 700-page report. This is a much kind of pithier, more accessible document. So if you don't have time to read the report, and I still would suggest that you do, but if you don't have time, that you might want to have a look at this documentation. So I'm going to just kind of run through what some of the questions are that we thought about, and that this guidance that was actually produced by the National Preventative Mechanism, which is this kind of collective of oversight agencies within the UK who oversee all different forms of detention. So what their guidance talks about. So one of the first things that they identify as needing to be thought about is, are staff generally just treating people basically with a level of dignity and respect? So are you witnessing empathetic, courteous, polite interactions? Are conversations generally respectful? Are conversations going on about things which really should be private in an open space? I'm sure anybody who has been involved in oversight in a detained or custodial setting can think of examples where they've sort of seen conversations taking place that just absolutely should not have been taking place in front of other incarcerated people or detained people. I can think of somebody being asked about their intentions around harming themselves or suicide, and it was conducted in front of a full waiting room of other incarcerated people. So secondly, are the signs of staff ignoring or belittling or taunting, using kind of abusive, aggressive, discriminatory language, that which might be kind of downplayed as it's just the way that we talk to each other, there's nothing meant by it, but actually are there indications of that kind of an abusive power dynamic that perhaps isn't being adequately reflected on? Thirdly, do you detect any evidence of a macho or domineering culture in any part of the institution? And that might not be kind of the interactions between detained people and the frontline staff looking after them. It might be in the way that management appear to speak to each other. It might be in the way that you are dealt with when you first get to the facility and you're going through kind of security, just those indicators of a kind of generally domineering, aggressive culture. Related to all of those, I think, and a thread that runs through a lot of these things is around the power imbalance, and whether there's a demonstrable understanding of what the power imbalance is and how to kind of try and mitigate what some of the risks of that might be. And so you would expect senior managers and middle managers to be able to articulate that and to discuss what they do to kind of mitigate potentials for aggressive or overreach of use of force, for example, or overuse of use of force. But you might not expect kind of frontline staff to be able to articulate it in that way. But you certainly would want to kind of understand how they saw their role in relation to the people that they are caring for, and to be able to kind of understand it, like, are they raising their voice at people, all of those, and asking them about, like, how do you think that impacts on those that you are dealing with. Looking for whether there is evidence that of a perception, a cultural perception, that actually those who have either committed a crime by entering the country illegally or have overstayed a visa, is there something about, you know, people not deserving rights because of the potential wrongdoing that has led to them being in immigration detention? So does there seem to be a theme of kind of people's rights not really mattering because of the reasons why they may be there in the first place? Is there evidence of, and this is kind of really endemic in immigration settings from my experience, is there evidence of staff treating different categories of ethnicities differently? So, and we heard evidence in the inquiry about stereotypes, racial stereotypes that have been applied to, well, to deal with X group of people, this is the best way to kind of get them to do what you want. But to deal with Y group of people, we will send a female officer in because of X, Y, Z, about their, you know, their particular stereotyping of what that group of people might need to be dealt with. So that, I think, is really interesting, in kind of if that's a normalized thing that you're seeing, that kind of differentiation between different groups and a different way of dealing with people and a rationalization of that as well. Is there evidence that abusive and dismissive and aggressive language and actions have become kind of normalized within the institution? So is there does there appear to be a robust approach to when force is used, and how often is it used, firstly, in what circumstances is it used, what are the oversight processes for when force is used? So one of the things that we found at Brook House was that firstly, that I was really worried about how often it was being used and the reasons why it was being used, but then also that there was a supposedly a kind of management structure to check on use of force, to have some kind of oversight and management supervision and reassurance and assurance levels that it was being used appropriately. But we actually had some instances of staff members who've been involved in an incident then doing the management check and saying nothing to see here, everything was fine. So what processes are in place, and are they being adhered to monitor the things that are particularly lend themselves towards being abused and tipping over into mistreatment? So primarily, yes, use of force, use of segregation, that's stripping away of kind of basic civil rights, bearing in mind that these people are being civilly detained and not detained in a criminal justice setting. The other thing that I think was really interesting was again around the degree to which staff were heavily impacted by what was going on around them. So we heard lots about staff in the inquiry talking about feeling burnt out, unable to cope with what they were, the demands of the job, excessively drinking, having marital problems, having all sorts of things kind of impacting their outside life because of the stresses of the job and the amount of hours that they were having to work, and that there was just no respite, and that they felt very unsupported by managers and senior managers. And so I think where there are one indicator of a potential for mistreatment and abuse in these types of settings is where there is a real sense of over-reliance on agency staff, high levels of sickness, poor staff retention and recruitment levels, where exit interviews are indicating that there are problems related to the culture of the environment, and where that's not being kind of documented and acted upon and treated seriously by senior management. And another one, again, super obvious, and for anybody who's done oversight work in a correctional detention setting, this is kind of bread and butter stuff, but a real sense of how visible and active leadership are in the facility. So whether they are actively on the units, whether frontline staff and detained people themselves know who we would call them a governor, a warden, a director of a centre. Do they know who that person is? If that person's out and about, are they actually talking to them? Have they got any clue who the senior managers are? Do they feel able to go up to senior managers? Do staff call on senior managers when they have particularly complex situations or incidents to deal with? And again, that was another real area of concern, that we saw several examples of really complicated, people with very profound issues that they were dealing with, detained people, and that the staff that were being relied upon to care for them and make decisions about what to do were very junior, and they just didn't have the support of people who have the experience and the training and the skills and are paid to actually be performing that kind of oversight and supervisory function, particularly in very complicated situations like a high risk person for suicide and self-harm, but somebody who's also violent to other people and is being held in segregation. So where there are kind of multiple competing complex needs. And then the final thing, I think, in relation to thinking about indicators of concern in relation to staff, is what is the whistleblowing and complaints process like? We obviously had, the genesis of the inquiry itself was from somebody not feeling able to use the whistleblowing processes. And I found it really interesting that in this particular instance, the private provider was a company that also does lots of other work. They don't just run detained and secure settings. So the whistleblowing process was something that appeared to have been developed for a setting such as a warehouse, a call centre, where the dynamics are very different. And actually, there's a real disincentive for staff to whistleblow against other staff members in these kinds of settings, because they obviously rely, particularly when they're short-staffed and in a high stress, volatile environment, they rely on their immediate colleagues around them to keep them safe. And so if you are suspected of being a whistleblower, a troublemaker, somebody who is kind of speaking out, then you genuinely face some risk. So it's not the same as whistleblowing in an environment such as a warehouse or a call centre, but there just didn't seem to be an adequate understanding of the difference, and that these types of settings operate very differently. Likewise, I think another indicator around whistleblowing and complaints type issues is, as somebody who goes into lots of different detained settings, I'm always really concerned when I have I can see some indicators of things that don't seem great, but that the level of complaints amongst incarcerated people or detainees is very low. And often I will kind of encounter this sort of false sense of confidence that, well, that's great, like people, we don't get complaints about that, like people seem happy with it, but actually people fearing or not understanding the complaint process, or just straightforwardly having no faith in it, is really concerning, because it's one of the biggest, most important indicators for senior management to understand what the problems are and to do something to remedy them before they become serious instances of abuse, of violence, of unrest, whatever is likely to happen in that environment. And they are high risk environments, and that's why the early indicators are so important. So I'm going to scoot through. This is So this comes from the same document that I've just kind of pulled a couple of examples from there. So this I just thought was quite interesting. This is aimed at independent monitors, so primarily those who are doing this kind of work in a voluntary capacity, or in a, then they're not necessarily doing it as a kind of full-time paid professional inspector or investigator, um, but they're kind of the core skills that often come out in terms of international human rights standards around kind of what you should expect when you go into investigate or oversee different forms of state detention. And I think that the threads of the need to kind of understand the need for oversight, external oversight agencies and individuals to appreciate the role that they can play, but what the limitations of that role are, and that it's very important that the organisations themselves take responsibility for genuinely understanding what's happening in their facilities and being the ones who are responsible for acting upon issues as they arise, and learning from when there are serious incidents that result in inquiries or investigations, making sure that they kind of reflect on the patterns that might emerge from an inspection or from information that comes from an independent monitor, for example. And so for those who are doing this external oversight and scrutiny, understanding what the limitations are and what they should be on yourself, and what you can actually achieve. You don't have the levers to actually change the policy and practice. It's your role to kind of be really tenacious in identifying what the issues are, and providing adequate evidence, and being really resilient and forthright in identifying time and time again, if that's what you need to do, the things that you are seeing. But having those kind of frameworks to look at what might be these indicators that, you're not likely to walk into a unit and see active physical hostility between staff and detained people, although you might, but it's unlikely that you're going to. But what you might see is that pattern of other things that tend to suggest that there's certainly a heightened risk that mistreatment or abuse could be taking place. So again, very happy that these slides will be shared, but very happy to point people in the direction of those resources if you're interested. Okay, that's the end of my slides. I think I've got another 6 minutes and then we'll go into the, so I'm very happy. I don't know, Tina, whether you've got any specific questions or anything you'd like me to cover before we switch into the discussion.
I do not, and I am surprised that we do not have any questions right now in the Q&A. But
Okay.
if anybody, there's still a chance to type your questions in. And in the meantime, let me get the link to the discussion, and I will put that in the chat for everybody
Right.
right now. And just as a reminder for everyone, if you click this, the Zoom link to the post-webinar discussion, you will be kicked off of this webinar. So be sure you're ready to be kicked off when you click it. The questions, a couple of questions are coming in now. And so one, what qualifications and training did the institution staff have?
So what we find in immigration settings is that the training is not as extensive as you would see in a correctional setting, for example. So the one thing that was really concerning to me was that the only kind of mandatory part of the training course that was so all of the course is mandatory, but the only kind of pass fail element of it was the use of force training. And I feel that sends a really worrying message that, you could be really not up to scratch on all the other elements, which include things like de-escalation, how you communicate, how all of the other things that you need to know about kind of safeguarding people. You could be not great on any of those elements, but if you do well on your use of force, then you can still go on to be a detention officer. And so I think it sends a really worrying message about how that is prioritized. And there was a real thread of kind of staff seeing their role as being about kind of security and discipline, as opposed to being, a lot of the time what you're there to do is kind of help support people who are awaiting the outcome of their deportation case. And so that, you know, it's a high risk environment because people are very distressed and it's volatile for that reason. It's not generally people are there because they've been identified as particularly kind of violent or dangerous. Oh, I can't hear you, Tina. You might be on mute.
I accidentally clicked my mute. Okay, so someone says you may have covered this, but how is the public engaged with the oversight and reporting of detainees?
Um, sorry, engage with the oversight and reporting. So I think, please correct me if I've misunderstood the question, but there was a real, there was genuinely concern when the documentary first went out about what was kind of happening in behind, you know, closed doors. And obviously the, we often have documentaries about kind of how prisons work, and but to genuinely kind of see what happens, because it was undercover as well, and so you can kind of, there's a real visceral sense of what, you know, when you hear this kind of um the cold analysis of what use of force looks like, you know, you read it, it's very different to kind of hearing it and seeing it and kind of seeing what that actually looks like in practice. And so there was a concern about what was actually happening and that there was very little accountability. I think the fact that we had that there was kind of so much media coverage of the findings of the report was genuinely really encouraging. I think, and I don't want to kind of add a downer note on this, what is really somewhat depressing is that of the 33 recommendations I made, the government has said that they've accepted 31 of them, but they've never actually told me how they're going to implement those recommendations. And so, and we still hear, I still get told a lot about what's currently happening in Brook House and issues of concern. And there have been other inspection or investigation reports that indicate that a lot of the same problems remain. So I think it's, you know, it's great that there was a public interest in it. What's less great is that, you know, we can't say that we solved the problem.
All right. And then one more question, and then we'll transfer to the Zoom room. Someone asked, are there any plans to implement trauma-informed care training for institutional staff?
Yeah, I mean, that's such an interesting question. And it's something that, so the independent advisory panel on deaths in custody that I sit on is really interesting because we look at all different forms of custody. So we look at police, immigration, prisons, and secure mental health settings. So the difference in the way that people are trained in those settings is so stark when you kind of, I went to a high secure hospital recently and talked to staff about how they kind of engage with the people that they're caring for. And one of the first things they said to me was, you know, everybody, the vast majority of the people that are in here, the patients that are in here, have a history of trauma. And so the beginning of any journey of that patient and the progress to them ultimately, you know, some of them will never be released, but a lot of them will, starts at what that trauma was and what the care path is through that. Can't say the same for the other settings. I think, you know, there's a real variation in practice. So I think, but I think it's really interesting to sort of see that contrast, and it's very much needed. It was one of the recommendations from the inquiry that staff who work in these kinds of settings absolutely need training in that.
Okay, thank you so much for answering those questions and for sharing this information. I want to give a couple of announcements before we head over to the Zoom room. So first, a reminder, the follow-up email the webinar follow-up email will go out within 5 business days. And so that will have a information on accessing the recording, the webinar recording, as well as a link to the PDF of the slides that were used today. Also, webinars for March or February, March, and April are already on the NACOL website. I think 2 of the 3 registration is open, and that final one, the third of the 3, we just need to get the information for registration set up. So that should be open soon. And then finally, the call for proposals for the annual NACOL conference will be going out in about a week. And so please keep an eye on your emails for that, and also on the NACOL website that we'll have information with the call for proposals on there as well. And so I want to thank Kate again for being here with us today, sharing this information, your expertise and your time, and then thank everyone who attended for always continuing to support NACOL. And the link for the post-webinar discussion is in the chat. And so I'm going to hang back a minute or two, to make sure everyone has copied that or clicked it who wants to. And just so you know, in the chat, you'll see along with the link is a meeting ID and passcode. You do not need that, but I provide it because every once in a while, for some odd reason, it will ask somebody. But 99% of the time, you don't need the passcode, but I just put it there just in case. All right, so I will see you in about a minute or two in the Zoom discussion room. And Kate, if for some reason you can't click over there easily, I will email it to you as well. Yeah.
I'll let you know. Okay,
Just
thanks,
in
Tina.
case.
Cheers.
All right, I'll
Thank
see
you.
everybody in a minute or two.
Thanks.